My name is Lane Scales, and I serve here at Baylor as Professor of Higher Education as well as Associate Dean in the Graduate School. And our topic today is stewardship in graduate education. And I'm going to introduce our panel of three, and I'm going to try to do it in a way that explains to you how we all relate to one another and how we've come together around this topic of stewardship. And I'll start with Dr. Chris Golde. I like to think of her as the golden thread that ties us all together. Dr. Chris Rios, who I'll introduce further in a moment, and I got to know her work, her publications, before we got to meet her in person. And most particularly the work that she has done with the Carnegie Initiative on the doctorate. The Carnegie Initiative began right as the century was turning, and it looked at doctoral programs across the nation, both private and public institutions, to try to determine what are we doing well in doctoral education and what do we need to rethink or reform as the 21st century comes. And that work was so inspiring to us, and particularly we were surprised but pleased to find a couple of terms that resonated with us at Baylor. One of those terms was the term of formation that talks about doctoral education as a process that involves whole persons. But the other term was this term of stewardship. We were familiar with stewardship as sort of a church word, and while the Carnegie Initiative on the doctorate was using it in some different ways, it was one that we embraced. And so as we got to know her work, we began to get to know her as a person, because at the same time, or when she completed her work with the Carnegie Initiative on the doctorate, she served in the graduate school at Stanford University. And so we would all gather each year at our national meetings and talk about professional development. And we shamelessly stole some of the ideas at Stanford that she had enacted with her graduate students and brought them here to Baylor as we worked on relatively new doctoral programs here and tried to build our professional development offerings here. So I keep saying we, and the we also involves Dr. Chris Rios. He serves here at Baylor as Assistant Dean for Graduate Studies, and he works particularly with professional development and student life kinds of initiatives in the graduate school. He's been doing that for about 6 years. Prior to that, he was a doctoral student here at Baylor, and he received his degree from our Department of Religion, specializing in church history. And so while he was a student, he worked with us in the graduate school, and we were thinking together and reading the book Formation of Scholars and reading the book about stewardship that Dr. Golde edited, and thinking about all of these ideas and how they might support and promote the programs that we wanted to implement. And so when he took this position as assistant dean, he began to create some of our best programs that we have for professional development, such as our graduate writing center, our dissertation writing lab, and other programs that he's going to talk with you about. Our newest friend and colleague is Rochelle Tractenberg. And again, through Chris Golde, she introduced us to Rochelle because Rochelle, like us, had found Dr. Golde's work, had contacted her to talk more about that work. And what she brings is a really great focus on her own discipline of statistics and getting her national group thinking about stewardship. She serves as associate professor at Georgetown University. She's a fellow of the American Statistical Association, and she's the chair-elect of the ASA's Committee on Professional Ethics. And before she was at Georgetown, she was for 5 years at the University of California at San Diego as a biostatistician. And she also worked as a scientist within a national consortium of Alzheimer's disease research centers. And her current work is on professional identity development, and she's doing that with the ASA. And so she has convinced the ASA that stewardship is the way they want to frame their professional identity development. So that's what we are gathering around, is this wonderful idea of stewardship and graduate education. Our format will be each speaker will speak for about 15 or 20 minutes, and we're going to save some time at the end for us to all have a discussion together about these ideas. And we're going to start first with Dr. Golde.
Thank you for that fabulous introduction.
Mm-hmm.
I've been really looking forward to this opportunity to talk because I think this panel is really intriguing to me. We have so often I think you're at a conference and you have three panelists and the kind of presentations like sort of relate, kinda, if you stretch your mind enough. But I really feel like our presentations like super well integrate. So where I'm going to start is by setting the foundation and really talking about the Carnegie Initiative on the doctorate. And then, the U.S. was recognized as the world leader in doctoral education. It's an enterprise we've been at for more than a century, but there are some very long-standing and systemic critiques. And these include changing knowledge structures, changing demographics, diversifying career paths, unstable funding structures, increasing time to degree and unsatisfactory completion rates, and there was one more, and increased pressures for accountability. So against this backdrop, the Carnegie Initiative on the doctorate was born under the leadership of then President Lee Shulman. And at the time at Carnegie, we were not only doing the doctorate project, but there was a series of research projects on studies of professional education, nursing, medical, engineering, clergy. There was a fifth one that's escaping me at this moment. The Carnegie Initiative on the Doctorate, or the CID as we called it, was a 5-year action and research project. It went from 2000 to 2005. We worked in 6 disciplines so that we could really get to know those fields. Specifically, those were chemistry, education, English, history, mathematics, and neurosciences. And we really were working at the department level because that's where the action is in doctoral education. We issued an invitation for participation, we called it, and we selected about 50 departments across universities, across those 6 disciplines that volunteered to work on the project. And the goal of the CID was for departments to really carefully examine their own doctoral programs and then make whatever changes they deemed were warranted and appropriate. So we did not have an a priori agenda about what those changes would be. We said, look carefully. If you affirm everything you're doing, then let's declare victory. If there's maybe a few things you think you might want to change and improve, then that would be the targets that you would do. And so that became a pretty open kind of an invitation. And I should note at this point that Carnegie did not give any money to departments for this, so that maybe the changes they made were more modest than they might have experimented with had someone dangled large bags of money at them. But I think that the changes they did make were ones that stuck because there was no kind of link to any funding source. So our view here, though, is retrospective. And we wrote a couple of books, as Lane mentioned, but our view here is really retrospective because it's been about 10 years since we ended. And so the question really is, what's the legacy of the Carnegie Initiative? And while I've moved on professionally to several other professional chapters and haven't really thought about this work a great deal, not nearly as much as my colleagues have, in fact, I will confess freely, it's been really a great opportunity to really sort of reflect on what our legacy is and to think about what's going on now. So there certainly were changes made in individual doctoral programs. And I think some of those have stuck to the point that they're now embedded. And I talked to someone who was involved, and she's like, you go back and they have no idea that's how come that change was made, was because of the work we did. And it was sort of like, yep, that's how it kind of goes, right? These things become embedded and nobody really thinks about their origins. And there certainly are continuing conversations nationally about reform and change in graduate education happening at agencies like NIH and NSF, at foundations like the Lumina Foundation, at national associations, disciplinary associations, in particular departments. And I think that our work continues to inform those conversations, but I think that our most enduring legacy is the legacy of ideas. And so I want to talk about 3 big ideas that I think had particular resonance and endurance, and I really think of as kind of our chief contributions. So that's what I'm going to spend the probably next 10 minutes talking about each of these ideas. And they're stewardship, formation, and intellectual community. And I want to say that being here at this conference is both really exciting because I think this is a conference in an institutional setting that's particularly hospitable to some of these notions. But I've also been really humbled by my very limited understanding of notions like formation relative to the understanding and the thinking that I've seen in the conference participation and participants since I've been here. I mean, I just read the program and the word formation is like in every third program. I'm like, I don't know nothing about formation relative to people here. So I just want to really note that. Okay, so let's start with stewardship, because I think that all questions about how doctoral education should be organized and what we should be doing really lead us to questions of purpose. And when we started the Carnegie Project, Lee Shulman, who was the president of the foundation at the time, who's a very smart man and a really inspiring thinker and speaker, if you ever have an opportunity to hear him speak, he's one of these people who will like go up and give a talk, and then afterwards people will be like, so, can we get a copy of that talk? And it's like, well, I have like 4 bullet points on 1 index card, and the whole thing happens sort of semi-extemporaneously, so there never is a record. So he just says like 6 brilliant things before breakfast. It's a little intimidating. But so one of the things he said that was really foundational for us was this. So I'll read it. I don't like to read slides generally, but with a quotation I think it makes sense. We view the doctorate as a degree that exists at the junction of the intellectual and the moral. Oh, I can read it from here. The PhD is expected to serve as a steward of her discipline or profession, dedicated to the integrity of its work in generation, critique, transformation, transmission, and use of its knowledge. So this notion of stewardship just really became important and foundational for us. And we really started talking about the purpose of the PhD to prepare stewards of the discipline. And so we spent quite a lot of time thinking about, writing about, and speaking about what this notion of a steward of the discipline is. And for me, it really means, I think what we said is it means accomplishment in 3 areas, which we said were generation, conservation, and transformation of knowledge. So with generation, what we're talking about is someone who can creatively generate new knowledge and defend knowledge claims, to conduct research and scholarship. And I think those words are used differently in different disciplinary contexts, according to really high standards of rigor and quality. By conservation, what we're talking about here is understanding the history and fundamental ideas of a discipline, and for you to be able to locate yourself in the kind of disciplinary map and landscape of your field. To think about how do you critically preserve the important ideas from the past, judging which ideas are worth keeping and which have outlived their usefulness, because we're always building on the work of others, but sometimes those ideas are outmoded or just, at least by contemporary thinking, wrong. And this is, I think, happens often in science. And then the new thing is then becomes wrong. But so there's this notion about how do you keep, what do you keep and what gets rejected. And then the third notion is that of transformation. And for me, this is really about communication and communicating effectively and clearly, and what are the applications and uses of knowledge. So I always put in here teaching in very broad sense of the word. So it's teaching and explaining and communicating. So it's in the classroom, but it's really about teaching any place that you're talking about ideas and being persuasive and trying to make claims of truth or knowledge and wisdom, and what the warrant is for doing that, as well as applying knowledge to important problems. But I think stewardship really is a role that transcends a set of skills and accomplishments. So I really think it has an ethical dimension. So we really started to really like this phrase here. Is someone a steward of the discipline? It's a little cumbersome, but is entrusted with care of the discipline by those in the discipline on behalf of those in and beyond the discipline. So it really has this important notion, a notion of importance. The word steward really originally comes from the medieval keeper of the hall, who was responsible for management of a medieval household. So a steward of the discipline thinks about the span of the discipline and how all the parts fit together. There's, of course, an ecclesiastical definition of stewardship, and here I think it goes back to the parable of the talents. I feel so tentative about saying these things here, with the emphasis on investment. So a steward of the discipline thinks about how to take risks and move the discipline forward. And I think maybe I'm more familiar with current environmental meanings of the word stewardship, which really thinks about the future and how to act in behalf of those who are yet to come. So a steward of the discipline also thinks about how to prepare the next generation of stewards. And I think that's really going to echo with what Rochelle is going to talk about shortly. So there are both, I think, notions embedded in this term stewardship. There's both conservative and forward-looking aspects of that. So they sort of live a little bit in tension. But I also think that this is a term, I would argue, that's really applicable to, say, all PhD holders really are thinking about becoming stewards of the discipline, and it can embrace that term, that it's not a like Nobel laureate Hall of Fame kind of term, that like someday you become a steward of the discipline, but I think it's a role we can all think about how do we inhabit that role, say at the point of the receipt of the PhD. So all of that helps us, I think about this notion of how does one become a steward, which leads to this second idea, that of formation. And again, I think that there is better thinking about formation as a developmental term than probably I've thought about, embodied in the folks in this conference. But we did call our second book, the book that was kind of the culminating book of the Carnegie Project, The Formation of Scholars. And that really is a term that came out of Carnegie's work on the preparation of the clergy, which really, I think, taught us about this notion of formation as a developmental process that really looks at a whole person and their work in the world, and that it really has an integrative aspect, which includes not only intellectual mastery, which is, I think, what we tend to think of with doctoral education, but also identity development and moral responsibility. I think it really anchors it in this purpose of preparing stewards of the discipline, and it really transcends this notion of a particular vocational setting, but it's really something one is and that one can do in any, it's almost agnostic to the setting in which a steward works. So as I said, the purpose of the goal of the Carnegie Initiative on the Doctorate was for departments to consider how their PhD program leads to the formation of stewards of the discipline, which meant that we were really actually I naively imagined, that the departments were really going to focus on particular practices and elements, like what's the new way to do the qualifying exams, how should we rethink doctoral supervision and advising and mentoring, what are different ways we can think about the curriculum. But what the faculty and the students who were involved on the ground in these Carnegie affiliated departments was they really seized on this notion of intellectual community as an important framing concept for thinking about how to reshape doctoral programs. They recognized, and we also recognized together, that a healthy intellectual community is kind of vital to the core purpose of doctoral education. And as it becomes an integral kind of way that we analyze community life and departmental life. So I'd say that many of you have probably visited or been in a department or are in a department now where you say to yourself, like, that is an exciting intellectual community. So think about a department you know. What made you think that? We identified 5 mutually reinforcing features of intellectual communities. So I'm going to walk through those now. I mean, if you heard Elaine Scales' presentation earlier today, she mentioned some of these as well. They're purposeful and knowledge-centered. The purpose of these communities is the creation and transmission of knowledge, and this is then visible in the seminars or the posters that are on the hallway, that kind of thing, the hallway conversations. They're broadly inclusive, and so and here I really think about several dimensions of difference. So they're welcoming of different points of view. They are very specifically and deliberately inclusive of people with different experiences and backgrounds. And they are multi-generational, so they include graduate students and postdoctoral scholars and faculty, and so there's a real multi-generational aspect to these communities as well. I like to think of them as flexible and forgiving. So these are places where risk-taking is okay, where it's really okay to make mistakes. You don't have to hide those. You learn from them. We know that everybody does, and that's an okay thing to talk about. They're respectful and generous. They support interaction rather than isolation. People are generous with their time, their ideas, and their feedback. So it's a place where your success does not come at my expense. And I think some of us have been in communities where it feels like it's a zero-sum game. Like, if you do well, that must mean that I am not doing well. And I think these communities are really the opposite of that. We all grow as everyone else does well. Well, and that means that they're deliberately tended. This doesn't arise by accident. All high-functioning workplaces and communities require creation, nurturing, fostering, tending. They really have to be deliberately worked at by all of the participants all of the time. So I think intellectual communities really became a useful organizing strategy for departments as they were thinking about how to improve their doctoral programs. And maybe one of the reasons that was because it's very hard to be against this. So really, I think I've never met anyone that was like, oh no, I would prefer not to be part of a healthy intellectual community. I would like to be in an academic department that does not embrace these things. So while people are often very suspicious of reform efforts or of trying new things, I think that incorporating that in this framework of intellectual community really becomes a way of kind of getting people to align a variety of their goals and purposes. All right, so those were the 3 big ideas I wanted to talk about. So in my 20-some years in the graduate education business, I've played a lot of different roles. I've been a student, I've been a faculty member, I've been an administrator, I've been a researcher, I've thought of myself as an advocate, I've definitely thought of myself as a critical friend. So I've had a lot of different vantage points, and I think as I think about this goal of improvement and increasing the impact and the effectiveness of graduate education, I've really started thinking about this as being like on a spiral staircase. There's a cycle of ideas and action. And so you're like walking up a spiral staircase, so you keep coming back to the same place like over and over again, but yet you're in a different place. You're like at a different angle and a different vantage point. So things are both the same and they're different. And so I think that's how I've really started thinking about the cycle of change is like a spiral staircase. So ideas about what we do lead to questions of purpose, a renewed sense of purpose leads us with ideas of what we can do. Like those things are just constantly iterating with one another. And I guess it's made me really think about how change is really a long-term proposition, particularly in higher education. So it's given me a little bit of patience as I go up the spiral staircase. I am, however, really encouraged when I think about how the work that we did at Carnegie continues to live on and has some legacy. So I said, certainly we had a legacy in some change practices and departments, although that is somewhat invisible at this point. I think we had some ideas that have had some life and resonance. And one of the things that's been really kind of encouraging is that quite recently it's become clear that there are several projects that call quite directly on our work at Carnegie that are in play and happening just today, these days right now. So I thought about, so this is sort of the handoff to the next presenters who are going to talk about some of those projects. But as I was thinking about the span of those projects as I understood them to be, or what the ones that I knew about, I sort of started thinking about a different image. I have to think about sort of diagrams and images is how I tend to think. So if we think of the world of graduate education as kind of a circle with formation of stewards as the purpose, we want to consider this kind of project of improvement, then I think there's a couple of different entry points or angles. So we can think about like kind of taking the disciplinary angle on this, like what's the kind of that angle or entry point into thinking about change. Or we could look at an institutional, which would mean by the university level or at the department level kind of angle of entry into thinking about these questions. And I think they kind of give us really different vantage points. So something I'm kind of hoping that we might talk about later. If we think about the green ones, if you will, the discipline-based ones, then there's three projects that I'm aware of. One is a grant that's pending. I'm told that it's very close to being approved through the National Science Foundation for a group of departments in chemistry, led by the chemistry department at the University of Oklahoma, and they have some really innovative ideas about curriculum change, and they're really wanting to start with the Carnegie affiliated departments there. And then two other projects around the responsible conduct of research, that's what RCR stands for, and the American Statistical Association. So these are two projects that Rochelle is involved with, so she's going to talk about those. The other angle, the kind of institutional or department angle, there is a project going on right now in Australia, which is a multi-institutional research project to reframe the PhD research project, like the dissertation project, as well as the advising and supervision of that project, and to think about how does that better, and to think about better aligning that with actual employment prospects, both inside and outside of academia. So that's, and they're very much calling on definitions of stewardship and pushing that work forward. The other projects that are going on are here at Baylor. So this has been my new move here to hand off to Chris Rios, who's going to tell you about those.
Thank you very much.
All right.
It is a real pleasure to have our guests with us. As Lane Scales said at the beginning, we've been thinking about this for a while, and so it's great to have this opportunity to reflect on how much it's meant to us. The SID's work, we called it the SID. For 10 years we've been calling it the SID. It is the Carnegie Initiative on the Doctrine of the CID. The Carnegie Initiative came at an opportune time for our efforts in the graduate school at Baylor. The last 20 years have brought remarkable changes to our university as a result of two transformative visions. First was Baylor 2012, and now is Pro Futuris, which both included a challenge to aggressively grow graduate education and research. And as a response, as part of this vision, and in response to national conversations that were then highlighting the importance of professional development for graduate students, our graduate school invested resources in this area, first by hiring Lane Scales as Associate Dean and me as Assistant Dean in 2011. though as Lane mentioned, I've been working with her largely on this since 2007 for the first years as her graduate assistant. Our early efforts benefited from a growing body of literature about graduate education. One piece in particular was a 2001 report by the Association for the Study of Higher Education titled The Socialization of Graduate and Professional Programs in Higher Education. This report described 4 stages that students experience as they move through their graduate programs and 3 key elements that mark their move towards professionals. The ASH report offered useful information about how graduate students experience their socialization, and it confirmed the importance of professional development in graduate education. The authors noted that students had changed dramatically in the past generation, and that much of this change had been intentional, with many universities recruiting a more diverse student body. The problem is that most of the programs that had attracted them had not. In response to these changes, then, the authors emphasized the need for professional development and called for faculty to encourage risk-taking and tolerance and collaboration and to establish significant mentoring programs. The ASH report was in part encouraging for us because it confirmed the need for our work, and it was somewhat helpful. But it was rather thin on details and offered little explicit guidance for building our programs. More importantly, its definition of socialization implied 2 assumptions that we wanted to avoid. First, that socialization was something that happened to students, not something they intentionally participated in. And second, that the goal was to socialize students into the same image as the mentor. Enter the SID. It was around this time that we discovered the work of Chris Golde and her colleagues, and here in the books about preparing stewards of the discipline and the formation of scholars, we found a set of principles that would inspire and undergird our work. Compared with the language of socialization, these ideas implied both an intentionality on the part of the faculty and an agency on the part of the students that articulated the visions we had for our program. And by taking seriously the changing landscape of doctoral alumni employment, it confirmed our view that formation need not be in the image of the mentor. It is probably no surprise to this audience that the principles of the SID resonated with many at Baylor as both Christians and scholars. And this is of little surprise, of course, to the authors of the SID as well. As Chris mentioned, they acknowledge the religious connections of several of their central ideas. Stewardship has clear implications in the arenas of both scholarship and faith, and this resonated with many of us at the start. In fact, for many here, this twin commitment to scholarship and faith is the most important aspect of being at Baylor and one of the most significant challenges and opportunities we face. As historian Mark Knoll, in his now classic Scandal of the Evangelical Mind, has described, and more recently in Randall Stevens and Carl Geiberson's 2011 book, The Anointed, 20th century evangelicals have been better known for creating a parallel intellectual culture than for participating in the intellectual and academic mainstream. While evangelicals are highly concerned with being orthodox in their faith, they are often quite unorthodox in fields such as history or science, and sometimes even quite dismissive about academic approaches to the Bible or theological scholarship. Thus, the idea of being faithful stewards of both one's discipline and one's faith was a challenge and identity that many at Baylor not only embrace, but see as the most distinctive and most important aspect of our university. Stewardship, as a model for doctoral education at Baylor, was thus a natural fit. The idea of inculcating the identity of a steward as one who guards, carries forward, and transforms their discipline was embraced by faculty and students. This is, of course, where I should acknowledge that stewardship does not resonate equally in all fields. As people like my friend Rochelle Tractenberg have helped me understand, the idea of stewardship is more foreign to some disciplines. For those of us in the humanities, the act of carrying forward the best that has preceded us is very much a part of the scholarly work. The scholarship of historians and philosophers and theologians thus tends to have a very long shelf life compared to the work in some science and social science fields. Nevertheless, on the whole, The idea of doctoral education as developing stewards of the discipline spoke broadly enough and deeply enough to provide a meaningful framework for our task. Similarly, the SID's focus on formation resonated with an ethos that's now articulated in Baylor's commitment to transformational education. I'll let you read that. This commitment is certainly not unique to Baylor. A simple Google search finds that many universities that are committed to an experience that is transformative or transformational. I consider this an encouraging sign. A focus upon formational or transformational education can be seen as a critique of ideas about education that have dominated the recent past. Earlier, the goal of learning was more focused on the inner life of the learner. Whereas for most of modern history, the evidence of being well educated has been found in what is able to do as a result of one's learning. Earlier views focused on who one was becoming. The SID's focus on formation thus might be seen as a return to an older, perhaps more Aristotelian view in which learning, even what we would think of today as scientific learning, was more focused on this internal formation. The final goal for education was less about being able to manipulate the world around you, what you could do, and more about inculcating mental habits and intellectual virtues, who you were becoming. Let me acknowledge, especially in present company, that I might be introduced in connections the authors never intended. But I don't think I'm too far off the mark. After all, in defining what it means to be a steward, the authors described it as a commitment to forming one's professional identity, quote, in all its dimensions. They wrote, "Stewardship encompasses, on the one hand, a set of roles and skills, and on the other hand, a set of principles. The former ensure competence, the latter provide the moral compass." This view resonates strongly with our commitments, and compared to the idea of being socialized, formation makes explicit the intentionality of this process on the part of the teacher and the student. A third attractive theme, which I hope will become clear in a minute, was the emphasis on the importance and the reliance upon student initiative. Stewards are formed through the dynamic relationship students have with their faculty, their subjects, their disciplines, and their peers, and the student must play an active role. The authors emphasized that while faculty play a key part in the process, the ultimate responsibility for formation falls upon the students. So how did these influence our work? As mentioned earlier, we have been thinking about and engaged in professional development for over a decade. We have often described our goals thus: to help prepare students for what comes next by offering programs that complement and enhance the work they receive in their own departments. Preparing them for what comes next means that we recognize the various stages through which they pass as they earn their degrees, and that expectations for each stage may not be self-evident. For some, what comes next is coursework or exams. For others, it's the dissertation or the job search. For example, it's probably no surprise to you that our annual workshop on how to prepare to write your dissertation or thesis is consistently one of our best attended events. By complementing and enhancing, we mean that we recognize that the most important and influential formation ought to occur within the academic programs. Thus, one of our first questions we needed to consider in applying the ideas of the SID was, what could we take on? What can we do from the graduate school level, and what activities do we need to inspire or encourage at the program level? For example, and perhaps most obvious, the task of forming researchers is primarily handled at the department level. One learns to be a chemist from other chemists, and so on. Still, there are things that we can do to contribute to the task. For instance, all scholarship requires writing. So we created a graduate writing center to support and help develop the writing done by our best, not our worst, our best doctoral students. We offer writing workshops in intensive weeks that both encourage academic progress and help instill the professional habits and skills that will benefit students throughout their careers. Additionally, our library over here has recently opened a graduate research center to help meet the distinct needs of graduate students and facilitate the collaboration between them. Each of these and many more have contributed to the formation of our students as scholars, either explicitly, as in the Writing Center or dissertation labs, or more implicitly by encouraging the intellectual community, a theme I'll return to in a moment. But the real question in helping to form researchers was how we could make the ideas of the Carnegie Initiative more broadly known within the departments in order to prompt the kind of reflection that and intentionality that the SID encourages. This, of course, is the slower, harder work because it relies more on influence than initiative. So first, we led faculty groups. The first one was with our graduate program directors in 2008, shortly after the formation book came out. There have been several others since, and Dr. Lane Scales has led many of them. Second is our graduate faculty development series. Good teaching is not necessarily instinctive, and neither is good graduate teaching. So we bring them together to talk about it. We offer workshops, just as we offer workshops for students on writing the dissertation, we offer workshops for faculty on how to direct the dissertation. The outcomes of these efforts are difficult to quantify, but there have been encouraging signs, and one of the clearest comes from one of our oldest and strongest programs, which actually assigns one of the chapters from the formations book. It's entitled Apprenticeship Reconsidered, assigns it to each incoming class with the goal of helping them understand the need to take ownership of their mentoring experience. If forming researchers is best handled at the department level, on the other end of the spectrum perhaps is the task of forming teachers. We have several departments who do excellent work in this regard, but it is also an arena where a centralized initiative can make a meaningful contribution. So we've developed our Seminars for Excellence in Teaching program, which planted the seed for what later became our now robust Academy for Teaching and Learning, and we have other programs for future faculty, including our Preparing Our Future Faculty program or a teaching capstone in higher education. As Chris said, another theme that has had great influence is that of intellectual community, what the authors called the hidden curriculum that instills powerful messages about purpose, commitment, and roles. This concept has helped us integrate priorities that we already had about community building and academic support, but had not aligned before the books came out. We had housing communities, a graduate student association, other programs that sought to build community among students, and many of these included among their goals an academic component. But it was always something of an add-on. Intellectual community helped integrate these goals, and it captured the imagination of the students. In 2010, our Graduate Student Association even picked the phrase creating intellectual community for its annual theme. This brings me to a point that I'm sure you all know well, about the energy and ideas that come when students catch the vision. We all know that students can be powerful agents for change. They can help develop new ideas, they can encourage faculty and administrators when they are otherwise reluctant, and they can be some of the best advocates among their peers, motivating in all kinds of ways. We have a number of great examples of this. One of the most successful has been the creation of our Conyers Scholars Program, a program for doctoral students interested in questions of faith and learning and vocation and the university. They bring together faculty, students, administrators, and community leaders for monthly discussions around a shared reading and a shared meal. This program embodies some of the most important ideas of the Carnegie Initiative. Another example is what we call our our student-initiated intellectual community enhancement money, SICM program. This started at the faculty level. Inspired by the Carnegie Initiative, we offered modest grants to departments to experiment with creating opportunities to enhance intellectual community among their students and faculty. The response was deafening silence. It's not that our departments don't care about intellectual community, it's just that this didn't reach them, and they didn't respond at all. So we did what anybody should do. We gave the money to the students. We allowed them to apply. And now, every year, we get many good programs that come in. The results came immediately. So here, in small ways with the SICM grants and with Conyers Scholars in large ways, we have seen the benefits of leveraging student agency and the kind of intellectual community that results from their initiative combined with a relatively small amount of institutional support. These are just a few of the ways that stewardship and formation have animated the work that we do here. But to close, I'd like to reflect on how these activities contribute to another, larger aspect of stewardship that flows from the disciplinary stewardship that is the focus of the Carnegie Initiative's work. One of the most important roles of any steward is to raise up stewards behind her, to cultivate within others a commitment to carrying on the work and preserving and advancing the field. And this is, of course, one of the greatest responsibilities and opportunities for those involved in doctoral education. When we talk about this at Baylor, we mean the stewardship of the individual disciplines, but we also mean stewarding the larger enterprise that is higher and graduate education. We are living through a period in which influential decision makers raise challenging questions about the value of higher education in general and graduate education in particular, especially towards those fields where the utility of their outcomes is less tangible. I don't mean to suggest that stewards need to be trained as apologists for higher education, but they ought to be able to appreciate not just their own work, but also the work that goes on around them. The worst stereotypes of college professors imagine someone who is so entrenched in their own narrow field that they are unaware of the work that goes on across the hall, much less across campus. Stewards of the discipline ought to be in part stewards of the academy. We also mean stewarding the commitment that unites many here at Baylor. This university has set out to be a leader in faith-based higher education. Baylor is perhaps the only Protestant and certainly the only evangelical research university in the nation. Many of our faculty, graduate students, and administrators take this fact quite seriously. We see ourselves as stewards of the discipline and stewards of the academy, and thus stewards of the long tradition of faith and learning that stretches back nearly 2 millennia. And it is because of that heritage that forming the stewards of the next generation is perhaps the most important task before us. Thank you.
Okay, so as Lynn mentioned, thank you both for those great presentations. They're really very different from what I'm going to be talking about. As Lynn mentioned, I'm a statistician. I just was elected a fellow of the American Statistical Association, so I'm actually a real statistician. But I am actually a cognitive scientist. I have a PhD in cognitive science. So when I approach statistics and challenges that statisticians encounter when they're trying to communicate with, humans, I come at it from a cognitive, scientific, and a social scientist's perspective. And thinking about stewardship has been essentially an obsession of mine since the book came out. And what I want to talk to you about, though, is that I'm in a sort of more isolated situation. I'm in a department of neurology mainly, and scholarship is sort of something that some of the clinicians do in their spare time, but it's in their spare time. They're not stewards of neurology as a discipline. They're professional neurologists. I work with nurses. They're stewards of their patients' health and well-being. So stewardship is actually something you can find and you can recognize across applications. But when a clinician wants to engage with a scientist, then there has to be some sort of a sense of the stewardship of the science that's going to go on. So what I want to talk to you about is how stewardship is actually reflected in your engagement in science, and how engagement can represent or deepen your stewardship. So I'm just going to quickly tell you what I'm going to talk about. You can doze at any point if you want. I want to talk about stewardship and how deafening silence occurs when you mention it to people, because maybe it's just too much to ask. We have to write grants, we have to grade papers, we have to do a lot of stuff, and also have our lives at home. Why should I engage in this whole other new mode of thinking when I am a statistician? It doesn't matter what I think, it only matters how many grants I write. Technically that is true. So I would propose that it is not too hard to ask, but I'm going to actually explain why I think that and give you some evidence, hopefully. And then I want to sort of just discuss how stewardship is reflected in your engagement in your daily duties as an academic, and how this engagement in your daily duties can actually become much more purposefully stewardly. So I've actually had students, I taught developed and teach a course in the responsible conduct of research, or ethical research ethics. And we mentioned stewardship from the first session. That it's not, the point of the class is not to sit through lectures on ethical frameworks. The point is to develop your sense of obligation to behave in the most professional and ethical way so that your work has meaning, your collaboration is valuable to others, and you don't pollute the science pool. But the students say, you know, they're PhD candidates or early in their PhD career, and they say, you know, I can't start thinking about that. I have to build my CV. So the question is, at what point can you realistically start to prioritize the discipline over your own CV? Because if I can get a paper, I really should. If I can get a grant, I really should. If that's not the most stewardly thing I can do that week, you know, I'll make it up. So at what point can you realistically start prioritizing the discipline at all? And a related question is, how could evidence that I am stewardly be generated? I want people to know that I'm a steward. I consider myself to be a steward, or I want them to know that I buy into this, I drink this Kool-Aid. Apart from the blue stain around my mouth, what evidence can I actually generate that I want to be a steward or that I am a steward? And this is my most, it's my most favorite and also the most terrifying question that students have actually asked me. Why should I be stewardly when I don't see anyone else being stewardly? And relatedly, the people who are about to start a lab can sometimes say, you know, let's say I do prioritize my discipline over my career or my CV. Will my students suffer? Will the functioning and funding level of my lab suffer if I choose to prioritize this sort of amorphous blob of a discipline over my career and my students? So that's sort of just the feedback that I get. You get deafening silence. I get rhetorical, absolutely nuts. But I want to take you on a little tangent back to European medieval guild structure, which is where the steward term ironically also comes from. There you have this traditional guild, which is a group of confirmed experts. So these people have generated evidence of their expertise, and other experts from the village or the town or the craft, they all acknowledge, yes, Chris is an expert. So this is a master craftsman. In this day and age, young men would complete or sign up for a years-long, some period of time, but usually multiple years-long apprenticeship. They would apprentice themselves, or their family would apprentice them to a master. You wouldn't apprentice yourself to another apprentice. You wouldn't apprentice yourself to someone who didn't demonstrate that they were a master of their craft. After some time as an apprentice, the purpose of the apprenticeship is ultimately to impart some skills. The apprentice who wants to leave an apprenticeship would then want to go out and ply their trade and do that job independently without the master helping them anymore. But in order to qualify to leave the apprenticeship, they had to generate a piece of work. That qualifying work, if the other experts said, you know, that's a qualifying piece, they would grant you a letter that would allow you to go and travel on a journey. Now you're a journeyman. You're traveling around, collecting more evidence, building up your portfolio, or getting a great idea to build something magnificent, which you would then bring back to the guild with a second qualifying piece. If it was deemed to be of enough quality, it becomes your masterpiece. That is the evidence that you have mastered the craft and you're now a master craftsman. So this is cyclical, obviously. It's probably something you're familiar with. But if you think about this purposeful, as we have heard, sort of development of a skill set, everybody's going to be different, but you need to have the same structure. It's going to go the same way, but not everyone's going to be a journeyman in the same path. And you can't achieve master level performance without purpose and focus. You have to always actively pursue these sorts of things. You can't expect master level performance to just happen. So thinking about the development of stewards, you have to think about how it can be done in a purposeful way. So we talk about sort of how there's professional identity development. It has to be initiated. It doesn't just usually happen. And the more agency you can encourage, the better. But you still have to have some kind of a structure. Thank you. Okay, well, I'm going to sit down. Okay, so as Lynn mentioned, thank you both for those great and can then take on apprentice stewards. So this idea that if what's confirmed about stewards in the academic sense is that they have evidence that they've effectively guided junior or apprentice stewards through to the journeyman stewardship level, you're confident that when they go out in the world, they will be independently owned and operated stewards of chemistry or biology or whatever it is. But without this sort of confirmation of the master's stewardship and their ability to confer those skills onto the apprentices, you don't really have sort of, it's not that it's not continuity, but you don't really have much of a guarantee or confirmation that that stewardship trajectory will ever be started or completed. So my argument to the American Statistical Association is that you need to initiate apprenticeship in stewardship with the graduate statistics students who are members of the ASA, and hopefully get them to at least be journeyman level stewards by the time they get their PhD or soon after. And then they can go out and through their service to the profession or their engagement in whatever their job is, they may end up to be master level stewards themselves. And the way that I'm suggesting to do this in the ASA is to help people to create a professional development portfolio, which is a documentation of your growth and development as a steward of your profession. So in this context, does anybody here have a teaching portfolio? No. Okay. So I'm a professor. I have a teaching portfolio. I've had one since I was in graduate school. If you're in graduate school, you might think about creating one. Go Google teaching portfolio, higher ed, and you will find a bunch of templates and sorts of things that need to be inside your teaching portfolio, like a statement of teaching philosophy. Why do you teach the way you teach? Why don't you teach at all, if that's what you choose to do? But what happens, what is collected in a teaching portfolio is evidence of making visible what you do as a teacher. Because when I'm in a classroom, what we do, an activity or something like Lee Shulman, something happens in the classroom and it's magic. And if you missed that day's discussion, then it's lost. So in my teaching portfolio, I talk about how do I get those magical moments to happen and how successful am I? Like 30% of the time magic happens, but 70% of the time they're snoring. So making your stewardship visible is similar to making your teaching visible. You create a portfolio. And mentees or students can begin a professional development portfolio if they want to do that in the American Statistical Association by documenting their commitment to stewardship as an idea. If you have a series of workshops, then going to the workshop and benefiting from the workshop should show up in your portfolio. And in this example, we have ethical guidelines for statistical practice that the ASA just revised for 2016. I was the chair of that committee, and I'm going to be, I have been the vice chair of the ASA Committee on Professional Ethics, and I'm going to be the chair starting in January. And having these guidelines has been great, except there's 18,000 people in the American Statistical Association, and 12 of them have ever even heard of the guidelines. So my mission for my chairship is to make sure that every single student who graduates from a program with a doctorate in statistics, at least, if I can't get any further than that, knows about them and understands that they are, complex and need thinking about. But anyway, you might imagine that the guidelines, this is a consensus document about what professional statisticians do, what you can count on from a professional statistician, what characterizes a professional statistician, and if that's promulgated, then you can imagine that you would see the ASA guidelines and say, okay, a person like that, I would trust the vigor, quality, and integrity of the field to a person who follows these. Like that describes a steward of this discipline. So that's kind of the approach that we've been taking for the students and the mentees, the junior statisticians. But my argument as a cognitive scientist is that you can't just expect people after they've had their PhD for 19 years to be stewards and have evidence that they are stewards. it turns out that after a lifetime or a quarter of a lifetime of time spent thinking about these sorts of things, you can compile this evidence. You just need to do it so that you can then be a confirmed steward. So I want to talk a little bit about how you might generate that information, generate that evidence or that information. So I am a journal editor. I review journals and grants. I write things. I'm currently not teaching, so I don't have any, I mean, my teaching portfolio is packed with stuff, but I'm not drawing any of my evidence about stewardship from those experiences. But these are things that I do every day of the week. I generate new knowledge every day of the week. Obviously, I'm an author. I defend knowledge claims against challenges and criticisms. That's what I do when I review grants and papers and when I write letters to the editor. So these are things, features of stewardship that I do every day of the week. I'm already doing this. So if I took this material that I'm already generating and start talking about it with respect to how it reflects my stewardship, then I've already got evidence that I'm a master level steward. I do this, that I'm a journeyman level steward. If I help my students do it, then I would describe how I am a master. But if I do it myself, I'm a journeyman. So in just as an academic, as a scholar, I'm already generating evidence of stewardship. But as an instructor or a mentor, because a lot of statisticians are not in academia, and there are a lot chemistry and biology, environmental science. There are a lot of scientists who are not scholars. They're not working in an academic context. They're still scientists, and they still have the opportunity to teach and mentor if they lead research teams. And as Chris was saying, that the teaching is really embodied in your communication. So those are other opportunities that you already have to generate evidence, either of your commitment to stewardly comportment, or that you are a journeyman level steward. So these are just some examples of, if you look at my teaching portfolio, my educational scholarship reflects transformation that I have done, although I haven't, because I don't have a stewardship portfolio, I haven't talked about how my stewardship is at the master level or not. But also, I would argue that the engagement that you do with your profession, so you get in your PhD in chemistry and you're going to go and be a chemist, you join the American or International Chemistry Association, you're engaged in your profession. You're training doctoral students, you're giving lectures at high schools, you have scholars at different stages in the intellectual community you create in your lab. You're engaged. And that does also represent stewardship, even if you are not a scholar, first and foremost. So if you think about a chemist at Dow or Bureau of Labor Statistics statistician, those people are not scholars. That's not part of their purview. But that doesn't mean they cannot be stewardly in their behavior. And in fact, you would hope that they are the most stewardly because there's so much at stake, business-wise, money-wise, and also, pollution-wise and stuff like that. So the idea of stewardship shouldn't be, I would argue, limited to people who are scholars or committed to being scholars. But engagement with your discipline, engagement with your profession, that is a place to be a steward and grow your stewardship skill and your portfolio. And by engaging with the profession, you can demonstrate your stewardship. And so there are two examples that both involve the ASA, because they're in Virginia and I'm in Washington, D.C., so they can just call me and say, hey, can you blah, blah, come over here and do something? And I'll almost always do, which is, I still can't figure that out. But anyway, it's really very interesting, and I think that my engagement with the profession really definitely does document my commitment, at least, to be a steward of the statistical disciplines. And when I am also engaging as a statistician to promote the best science that my clinical colleagues can possibly produce, I'm also a steward of science overall and their disciplines. I'm encouraging them to be stewardly in their work, for the nurses or for the neurologists or the neurosurgeons. So I'm helping them, I'm modeling stewardly behavior, and I'm helping them to be more stewardly as well. So I don't think that stewardship is too much to ask unless you expect it to arise spontaneously, which is just plain crazy. Then it's way too much to ask. If you just say, okay, everybody ready, steward, that's not going to happen. But I think You can show that you're a steward. If you think about it, you can go through your materials and say, here's the definition of stewardship. What have I got in my 12 courses I have taken, or 3 lectures I have attended, or whatever it is? I have some evidence. And when you see that, oh, if I only blah, blah, then I would have evidence, then there's a plan. You know what to do. So you can create your own professional development portfolio. You can model it on a teaching portfolio because there are models for those things. And this can be something that can help you build your CV without it being a zero-sum game for the discipline, for example, that you're not just going to publish because you need to publish. You're going to publish something meaningful that's actually going to move science forward, for example. So it's not such a big ask. The point at which you can realistically start prioritizing your discipline over your CV is your first day of school. And if you're starting a new job as a new professor, your first day as a new professor. Integrating the idea of stewardship into what you do every day isn't a huge ask. But if you need to see or generate evidence of a commitment to stewardship, you can create a portfolio for yourself. If you want to encourage your students to become more stewardly or to commit to a stewardship mentality, you can ask them to create a portfolio and ask them to identify gaps and identify opportunities and start to do the matching. This is the kind of skill that I need. This is when I saw an opportunity to write a grant. Is that a way to be stewardly? That's a great way to start a conversation. Why should I be stewardly when I don't see others doing it? I have had this conversation with my last 2 mentees, and when the academic pressures become soul-crushing, having a portfolio to reflect on apparently is really, really very comforting. Knowing that you're doing good work, that you're making the world a better place as a statistician, which may seem like a shock to some of you, but that's actually possible. Being able to look back over your career or trajectory with that sort of perspective can actually be really reassuring. And then I would say no, it's not a problem for your lab or your students if you prioritize the discipline, because you're modeling for them what stewardship of the discipline needs to be for the future, and you're encouraging them to be as active and have as much agency in their own formation and also in the sustainability and vigor of the discipline as is possible, which is what you should be doing if you have students. So now these are some references that if you are interested in, I can share with you. But as Lynn mentioned, we had some questions that we had been considering for discussion, but we will be happy to entertain questions that you have about any of our talks.
If you all
Brave.
thank you.
Hi, I am Jessica Martin. I'm from Oklahoma Baptist University. I am a senior visiting December in anthropology and community services. And as an anthropologist, I firmly believe in kind of an offset of engagement for stewardship is exposure. I believe the best way to apply whatever field you're in is through setting yourself aside the presuppositions that you may already have based on your life biases or anything you've previously been exposed to better understand the people that you're actually wanting to work with or learn better. And so how would Baylor, I guess this is more for you, how would Baylor assist in a student venturing towards a graduate department, or how would they make the best decision in cultivating in them, which is essentially stewarding within themselves, cultivating in that career that they want to be a little more humble towards the people they don't know so that they can actually be stewarded by these people they have yet to meet. And like I guess what department at Baylor is kind of gearing toward that. If all of them do that, I guess, but more in the ethnographic maybe for the anthropological side of
Sure.
myself, or anything that I may not already know.
You're turning away. I think.
We're turning towards
Yeah,
you. Listen.
Baylor.
No, I think that's a great question. Thank you very much. I think that both my colleagues will have something to say, because I don't think it's unique to Baylor. I mean, I don't think it's unique to anthropology. How do you put aside the hubris or something that you said? You know, it's not that there was nothing good in that Ash report that came out in 2001 that I mentioned. There was something good, and one of the things that was good is they talked about in those 4 stages that graduate students go through as they professionalize. The earliest stage is kind of the recruitment stage. And the phrase they use is that this is when novice learners are clumsy and idealistic with jargon and methodology. And I think, I know several people who are beyond that stage who still deal with hubris. But I think there's a sense in which that's part of the department's job. And if you're in that if you find a department with an intellectual community, they remember, I used to be like that too. Who does it best at Baylor? I won't name any names. We don't
Besides you.
We don't have a graduate program in anthropology, so it won't be our anthropology program. But we have some. It was certainly true. I came to Baylor as a graduate student, as a doctoral student in 2005, after a career in secondary education. It was true when I came in now. I still hear it said by students, not just in my departments, but in departments otherwise, that they come to Baylor and they have found a place where the competitiveness that they found in other departments at other places. The reason I came here was because I felt like everyone was rowing in the same direction. We were all on the same team, even at the student level. And I don't want that to be a judgment against other universities. I certainly don't think that's the case. If you can get into Georgetown or Stanford, I think that would be a fantastic idea. But that was one of the things that was appealing. That is something that's appealing to some people I know who have come in. I would love to hear how things are at other places.
Well, I was just going to comment on the anthropological tendency, especially if you do qualitative methods, to put your biases aside so that you can actually hear the message. That is actually specific to anthropology, I'm sorry to say.
Yeah.
So, it's awesome and totally missing and would be great in other fields as well. But at the same time, so I'm a statistician and an experimental psychologist. So when a clinician comes to me and says, I need you to do something or another, and I say, okay, well, why don't you tell me what you want to do? They don't put their biases aside. They say, well, the statistician needs me to use numbers in my presentation. And I remember that word ANOVA. So can you do an ANOVA on my totally nominal data, which is that's not right. So I say that why don't you just tell me what you want? Just say in words, use your words, Dr. Smith, tell me what you want. And it can be really hard. So the bias issue, it's really hard, and when people go too far in the other direction and they say, here's a word you'll understand, but you obviously aren't going to understand all the other ones I use, that's also a problem. But that continues. It's not something that goes away or is magically addressed. So my advice would be to identify your core and pursue your core, taking advantage of the resources around you. You could be an anthropologist, get your PhD in chemistry, and still be an anthropologist. So it's about, in the sense that the formation is actually about you, the learner, but you want to be able to develop into a person who can give back or preserve the discipline, whatever it is, that duality can exist. And it actually doesn't matter where you go or what department you do, if that's sort of the duality that you can maintain.
I was going to say, I believe limits are relative.
Yeah.
Because of that, I know anthropology can be super beneficial to almost any field because it is the study of people. It's the study. If you are engaged in any other culture, business and marketing, law, medicine, anything where you are involved with other cultures, I think it's applicable. But I also definitely agree that there's just certain circumstances you should not limit yourself to. And that's why I was asking if there's any department that could, or do you encourage, does the graduate departments at any university encourage up-and-coming possible graduate students to maybe do their own independent study of something that maybe the school doesn't offer? Is there opportunity for them to engage in something that maybe isn't aware in the graduate department that, oh, that's a great idea, this is something that might other students be interested in?
I don't know if you've heard about it, but Brown University had a do-your-own-major sort of thing, which kind of seemed squishy, but actually was extremely rigorous and informed by educational and pedagogical theory. I heard a rumor that they just stopped it for 2017, but you can go to that, go to the program, go to Brown University and look at their, it's not called interdisciplinary, it's not called do-it-yourself. There's some intermediate term, and I can't remember what it is. But I mean, I was just looking at it, and I was just tragically disappointed to hear that they had ended it. Because if you want to do something with like big data and, plastic, you constructed formally a curriculum for yourself, and they monitor your progress all the way through it. If that seems like something that's the next big thing, big data around plastic, they would actually allow other doctoral students to follow the path that you created.
Okay.
So it's really, that kind of a model they were the only ones who did it, because that's really brave and effortful, but still really worthwhile. But that's something you might look at, is sort of how that worked and how you might be able to do something like that.
Okay.
We have time for maybe one more. We have 5 minutes.
Dr. Tractenberg,
Yeah.
I really liked your concept when you talked about confirmation or confirming stewards.
Mm-hmm.
And I was wondering, as you have tenure, Dr.
Yeah.
Scales has tenure, and tenure seems to be a good process in which we discern who are the confirmed
Not at all.
stewards.
Absolutely 100% the opposite.
Hypothetically.
No. The answer is
How
no.
do you
No.
think the process should be changed, if you think it should be changed, to discern who is a confirmed steward?
Well, so I think that's a great idea, to actually change it in a way that is more reflective of the purpose. But the purpose of the institution, as we have discussed, is not to educate, it's to stay in business. So putting that aside, when faculty are on committees making decisions like that, then you have a room full of stewards who may be judging a portfolio of information. So for example, I'm in a medical center campus. My primary appointment's in neurology. I'm obviously not a neurologist, and I have appointments in 3 different departments. So I have to have approval and letters from 3 different department chairs. And I have to choose one of the disciplines to get my arm's length reviews from and all of that stuff. And I have to prepare my packet to be convincing to people in the medical center whose mentality is more grants driven, so that it will get past that committee and go to the main campus committee, whose interest is much more balanced between teaching and service and scholarship, which could include grants, but could also include papers. So I have a teaching portfolio. The medical center was like, what is that? But the main campus was like, look at that. That was awesome. So thinking about the context and who's there and what do they consider stewardship is really, really important. But you can't like say, okay, if it was just like this, then this problem would be solved. Because depending on, and for another example, my portfolio of work wasn't even eligible for tenure in the medical center, because up until 2011, you couldn't get tenure if you didn't have independent first PI'd grants. But because statisticians are so important in clinical research, they changed the definitions so that you could be, if you're a team scientist, then you do qualify. So of course, every grant has to have a statistician. So I instantly had a portfolio packed with evidence that I am tenure worthy, and then I applied and I got tenure. So it's those sorts of cultural changes that we've talked about. It's not, conserving what's useful in the past and finding out that having an R01 from NIH is the only meaningful value, meaningful way of judging. That's not true anymore.
So I'm going to respond in an idealistic way as opposed to in the realistic way.
Yeah, no.
I won't call it cynical, but it felt.
You can totally see it's cynical. I am
it-
extremely cranky.
Yeah.
People know that about
I
me.
think if one dials back, and I think rarely do our conversations about tenure really focus on the original purpose of tenure, and anytime I talk with students and young faculty about tenure, I think that our conversations are almost always procedural. Like these are the
That's right.
steps need to do, not purpose and rationale driven. And so the purpose of the tenure system, clunky as it is, so it's a very imperfect mechanism, rather like democracy, but better than anything else we've come up with yet, for preserving a social compact that says, well, we need to preserve institutions and places where people can ask difficult questions and make claims that might be uncomfortable. And that's an important thing for us as a society, and that's why we have universities. And the deal is you get kind of lifetime employment in exchange for evidence and proof that you can do your work at the highest standards, that you do not make claims that are irrational and unsupportable, but and that this takes a probationary period, but that you can have warrant and standing. And so if that's the frame, then I think stewardship really fits in that frame, in an
Absolutely.
idealistic frame. The reality that we live in is that human institutions are highly imperfect, and people are pressed for time and develop a lot of shortcuts. So grants become a shortcut or imperfect proxies for those kinds of things.
But I have to say that in my tenure application, and I just applied to be promoted to full professor, and in that as well, my whole first 2 pages are about stewardship. Every single section of my proposal, my application, is structured around stewardship. Here is how my service shows I am a steward, or I am committed to stewardship, and in these ways, my discipline, other disciplines. I have 2 PhDs, I'm a steward in both disciplines. When I bring them together, I'm a steward of more disciplines. So every single component of my application talked about stewardship and how I am a steward, and if you give me tenure, or if you make me a full professor, I will steward the pants off this place. Like, come on.
And
So-
we think she can do this.
Yeah.
I'm
Anyway,
afraid we're out of time.
thank you for being here.
Yeah,
And
thank you very much.
for-